How often do you forget about something right at the moment when you need that information the most? Like when you have a test. That sucks, right? But what if I told you all it takes for me to easily remember shit is just by following this one simple rule? Okay, the simple rule I learned to be able to easily remember anything, and I mean anything, is called the effort rule. Basically, the more effort we put into memorizing a piece of information, the easier it will be for us to recall that information in the future. I mean, it's no surprise that we keep forgetting things given how effortless it has become to store information. Need to remember a phone number? Put it in your phone's contact list. Need to make a note from a lecture? Just type it down on your laptop. Compare it to how you would have achieved this in the past, where you had to write that sort of information down by hand. And writing by hand is definitely not as easy as typing it down. If you don't believe me, experts proved this rule in 2014 when a study was conducted at Princeton University where the researchers split two groups of students. One group wrote down notes by hand, and the other typed them down on their laptops or other devices. The study found that the second group ended up with more notes compared to the first. But surprisingly, the first group scored higher in tests, even surprise tests. The study did not only prove the effectiveness of the rule, it also showed that we could even store less information as long as we put a little bit more effort into it. Now, I already mentioned one way to better store information: writing it down. This works for simple information such as addresses or phone numbers, but for something more complex, we need to go beyond just writing it down. We need to organize the pieces of information. Let's say you're writing down lots of notes about a chapter from your study material. When the notes are scattered and unorganized, it's going to be harder for you to make sense of them as time passes. So when I'm trying to remember a complicated topic, I use this method called the chunking technique, where I basically break down large information into smaller groups. I use this technique on practically anything I'm learning about, including self-improvement. You see, I consume a lot of self-development content myself. Podcasts, articles, books, videos, you name it. For every single thing that I consume, I would briefly summarize the ideas and pieces of information that I find to be interesting into one paragraph, so you can imagine that I have plenty of notes on self-improvement alone. Because of that, if I don't organize these summaries, the ideas I find to be interesting will just remain as scattered individual notes, and I'll just end up forgetting it all in the long run. So once I have a week's worth of notes, I'll go through every one of them and first check if some of the ideas I wrote down can be connected with the others. For the ideas that I can pair together, I will compile them into one longer note, which involves rewriting. For ideas that are best left as singular advice, I will simply group them with other ideas in the same category, building habits by clipping the notes together for me to reread in the future. Now, that process is just one example of how I use chunking. Basically, what you want to find are similarities or patterns from the pieces of information that you're trying to remember. You can try to replicate my process, but don't be afraid to make changes or even make your own approach, because what matters is you can process the information in a way that makes sense to you. I get that this seems like so much work, but think of this as the effort rule on steroids. Not only does the extra effort create the necessity for our brains to remember the information, but by grouping the different pieces together, we are actually working along with our brain's tendency to look for patterns and connections. We are also reinforcing our understanding by making these connections because it means that we can see the bigger picture. And for the last technique that I use to remember something, in the long run, is repetition. It's as simple as it sounds. Whatever it is you've written down, whatever information you've grouped together, reread them. Thankfully, we don't need to go over the information we want to remember every single day for the rest of our lives. We just need to space them out, strategically. Start by rereading once every few hours. Then go through it again the next day, the next 2 days, the next 4 days, and then repeat it at the end of every week. To store information in our long-term memory, we need to refresh it every now and then. But know this: the space between each repetition is the key to this technique because our brains need enough time to process the information between each repetition. So you can't just spam the repetition over and over again without any breaks. you'll just end up overloading your brain and you'll start to forget the details of other information. Your short-term memory can only hold so much information, just like the way storage works on our devices. Once it's full, it overwrites data. Well, your short-term memory kind of works the same way. Once your short-term memory is full, it will overwrite what you memorized before that point. So really, give yourself and your brain a break. Before you go anywhere and before you forget everything I talked about in this video, I want you to try out the techniques I talked about in the video. It could be a chapter you're studying, the vocabulary of a language you're learning, or if you're coming up with a blank right now, why not try it out on this video? Rewatch the video and summarize the key ideas I discussed. If you also watch other study tips videos, check at the end of the week if you can connect what I talked about with the other videos you watched, or not. Now, this should be pretty easy since you have already understood the key ideas I discussed. But don't just stop there. Think of these techniques as new tools that you can use in your studies. Apply it to any important information you need to remember. And in no time, you'll be able to use these tools with ease. So while your memory is still fresh, go ahead and try out the techniques I discussed right after the video ends. Also, don't be afraid to experiment with other memorizing techniques out there because our brains can operate very differently from one another. Let's achieve life.